Miss Marple set her teacup down with the gentlest of sounds, though her attention had wandered far from the delicate ritual of afternoon tea. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere of Widow Harrington's drawing room. The room possessed all the quiet elegance one expected from a lady of her standing, pale rose chintz curtains that filtered the autumn light into soft amber pools, a cabinet of Dresden shepherdesses arranged with military precision, and 3 carefully positioned photographs of the late colonel in various stages of his distinguished military career. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, Miss Marple detected the unmistakable tension that preceded revelations, like the peculiar stillness that settles over a garden moments before a summer storm breaks. "Do try the seed cake, Miss Marple," urged Mrs. Finch, the widow's companion, whose pink complexion and nervous flutter suggested she found comfort in the familiar rhythms of hospitality, even when the world around her seemed to shift on uncertain foundations. Her plump fingers worried at the edge of her napkin as she spoke, creating tiny pleats that she smoothed and reformed in an endless cycle of anxiety. Cook has quite outdone herself today, though I fear she's been rather distracted of late. The maid, Rose, hovered near the mahogany tea trolley with the particular anxiety of someone who feared that any movement might trigger catastrophe. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered the cut-glass sugar bowl, and Miss Marple noticed the faint scent of lavender water that clung to the girl's starched apron, mixed with something sharper and more chemical. Benzene, perhaps, the kind used for cleaning delicate fabrics or removing stubborn stains. The girl's pallor had taken on a greenish cast that spoke eloquently of sleepless nights and a conscience that refused to grant her peace. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple said with the gentle warmth that had, over the years, encouraged countless confidences from troubled souls. She accepted a thin slice of the golden cake while her observant eyes catalogued every detail of the scene before her. The silver sugar tongs bore a slight stickiness near the hinge, as if they had been used for something other than their intended purpose. And when Lionel Harrington, the colonel's nephew recently summoned from his London lodgings, reached casually for the sugar bowl, she observed that his own cup contained no lemon despite his earlier, rather pointed request for it. Lionel possessed the restless energy of a man accustomed to more stimulating company than village tea parties and elderly relatives. His tweeds were well cut in the modern fashion, but showed the telltale signs of hasty travel. A wrinkled waistcoat, mud on his shoes that suggested he had walked quickly from the station, rather than waiting for the trap. There was something in his manner that suggested he had not been invited to this gathering so much as summoned, and when his gaze drifted toward the corner writing desk, with its array of silver-framed photographs and neat stacks of correspondence, Miss Marple caught the calculating look that crossed his sharp features. "I trust your journey from town was comfortable?" Widow Harrington inquired, though her voice carried an undertone that suggested the question was merely social convention. A thin veneer of politeness stretched over deeper concerns. "Tolerably so, Aunt Althea," Lionel replied, helping himself to another cucumber sandwich with unnecessary vigor that sent a shower of watercress onto the Persian carpet. "Though I confess myself puzzled by the urgency of your telegram. Come at once seemed rather dramatic for a family tea, particularly when one considers that we haven't corresponded in nearly 6 months. The widow's carefully maintained composure wavered almost imperceptibly, like a crack appearing in fine porcelain. She rose with deliberate grace and moved to the marble mantelpiece, her silk skirts rustling with each measured step. Her hand reached out to adjust the central photograph of her late husband in his South African uniform, a gesture that seemed more nervous habit than housekeeping. The silver frame gleamed in the lamplight, polished to a brightness that bordered on anxious, and Miss Marple noted how the widow's fingers lingered on its surface with an almost protective tenderness. A pulled thread at the cuff of the widow's cardigan caught Miss Marple's eye, a fine loop that might easily have been snagged by a ring with a high setting. "Sometimes, Lionel, matters arise that require immediate attention," the widow said, her voice carefully modulated. family matters that cannot be discussed in letters or postponed for convenience. Miss Marple's keen gaze followed the widow's movements, noting the tremor in her hand as she touched the photograph's frame. There was something in that gesture, protective, almost possessive, that spoke of secrets shared between husband and wife, confidences that might not have died with the colonel but lingered on like shadows cast by a setting sun. "I do hope nothing is seriously amiss," Mrs. Finch ventured, her crocheted reticule clutched tightly in her lap like a shield against whatever revelations might emerge. "You've seemed rather out of sorts these past few days, Mrs. Harrington." The widow returned to her chair with the careful movements of someone who feared that any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile equilibrium of the moment. Her teacup trembled against its saucer as she lifted it, creating a tiny musical note that seemed to hang in the air. "There has been a small domestic matter," she said finally, her words chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. "Nothing that cannot be resolved with proper understanding and discretion." Her eyes moved meaningfully toward Rose, who had gone quite pale and was staring fixedly at the intricate pattern of the Turkish carpet as if it held the secrets of the universe. The girl's distress was palpable, radiating from her like heat from a fever, and when she bent to offer more hot water from the silver kettle, Miss Marple caught sight of her reddened wrists, the kind of chafing that came from scrubbing something vigorously and repeatedly, perhaps trying to remove stains that proved more stubborn than anticipated. "Rose, dear," the widow said quietly, "would you check that the drawing-room fire is properly banked? We wouldn't want any accidents." As the maid hurried from the room, clearly grateful for the reprieve, Widow Harrington turned to her remaining guests with visible effort at composure. "I find myself in a rather delicate position," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something has gone missing from my personal effects. A sapphire ring that belonged to my mother, not valuable in monetary terms, but precious to me for sentimental reasons." Lionel's cup clattered against its saucer with undue force. "Surely you don't suspect—" "I suspect nothing and no one," the widow interrupted firmly. "But I believe the ring may have been borrowed by someone who found it attractive and perhaps intended to return it. I simply wish it restored to its proper place without any unpleasantness." Her diction was careful, her emphasis precise. Miss Marple recognized the particular quality of language used by those who feared the full truth might prove more damaging than partial revelation. The widow's insistence on avoiding unpleasantness suggested something far more complex than simple theft. "When did you last see the ring?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone light as if she were asking after a favorite geranium. "3 days ago. I'd placed it in the small blue bowl on my writing desk. I sometimes remove it when doing needlework, as the setting catches on the thread." The widow's gaze flickered toward the corner desk, and Miss Marple noted that the key to its locked drawer hung on a ribbon that appeared distinctly frayed, as if it had been handled with unusual frequency or perhaps anxious fingers. Rose returned to the room with her composure better arranged, though the benzine tang had been banished along with the stained apron. She now wore a fresh one, pristine and uncreased. She moved about with exaggerated care, as if convinced that one wrong movement would set off some hidden alarm. Miss Marple rose with an old lady's careful economy of movement and crossed to the writing desk. The surface was orderly in a way that suggested things had been touched and then carefully replaced. The small blue bowl was pretty, a modest piece with a faint crackle to the glaze, and Miss Marple noted the faintest crystalline residue around its rim. Not sugar, too fine for that, but salt, perhaps, the kind certain fastidious housemaids might use to polish tarnish when proper paste ran out. "May I be of help?" Miss Marple asked finally, turning back with her smallest smile. "Sometimes another pair of eyes can be useful. I have a deplorable habit of noticing small things." The widow hesitated, the struggle plain in the delicate muscles of her throat. Around the room, the assembled company seemed to hold its collective breath. Lionel's hand stilled on his cigarette case. Mrs. Finch brightened with obvious relief, and Rose's gaze flicked up and then away with the quick movement of a startled bird. "If you would be so kind," the widow said at last. "It is only that I cannot bear the thought that someone in my house should feel driven to—" She left the sentence unfinished, but Miss Marple understood. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that people rarely stole for simple reasons, and that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most respectable facades. The afternoon light was fading, casting the room in golden shadows, but Miss Marple settled back with the patient attention of someone who knew that truth, like a shy creature, would emerge only when it felt safe to venture into the open. Miss Marple's acceptance hung in the air like incense, sweet and somehow final. She rose from her chair with the deliberate care of someone who understood that hasty movements often disturbed more than furniture, and made her way to the writing desk, where the afternoon light, now deepening toward amber, fell across the polished mahogany surface in geometric patterns. The widow's breathing had grown shallow, almost imperceptible, and Lionel's drumming fingers stilled against his knee as if he too sensed that something irrevocable was about to unfold. The desk itself was a study in careful order, each item positioned with the precision of someone who found comfort in ritual. Miss Marple's eyes moved across the leather-bound journal, the silver inkwell with its mother-of-pearl inlay, and the small stack of correspondence tied with what had once been a cheerful lavender ribbon, but now showed signs of frequent handling. Her gaze settled on the small blue bowl, sitting in its accustomed place like a faithful pet waiting for its master's return. "Such a pretty piece," she murmured, lifting the bowl with the reverence one might show a piece of ancient pottery. The porcelain was delicate, a shade that reminded her of forget-me-nots in her own garden, with the faintest crackle in the glaze that spoke of age and careful use. As she tilted it toward the light, the crystalline residue she had noticed earlier became more pronounced. Not the coarse granules of kitchen sugar, but something finer, more ethereal, with an almost iridescent quality that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in tiny rainbows. She touched her fingertip to the rim, then rubbed thumb and forefinger together experimentally. The substance dissolved instantly, leaving a faint sweetness on her skin, but underneath it was something else, a metallic tang that made her think of old pennies or the taste that lingered after handling silver that needed polishing. "How curious," she said, so quietly that the others had to lean forward to catch her words. "This residue, it's not quite what one would expect from a simple jewelry cleaning, is it?" Widow Harrington's composure wavered like a candle flame in a draught. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. I sometimes use a mild solution to clean my rings. Nothing harsh, of course." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed, setting the bowl down with infinite care. Her attention shifted to the key hanging from its ribbon, and she lifted it with the same gentle precision. The ribbon was indeed frayed, but not from simple wear. The damage was concentrated near the loop, as if someone had pulled or twisted it repeatedly in moments of high anxiety. The brass key itself was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been from merely hanging in the afternoon air. "You mentioned that you keep personal papers in this drawer," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. "Letters from the Colonel, I believe you said." "Yes, private correspondence. Nothing of monetary value, but precious to me." The widow's voice had grown thin, stretched like wire. "I wouldn't want them disturbed." Miss Marple nodded with perfect understanding, though her eyes had caught something else. A faint smudge on the brass lock plate, barely visible, but distinctly there. It was the kind of mark left by fingers that had been less than steady, perhaps trembling with nervousness or haste. "I'm sure they're quite safe," she said, "though I notice the key has been used recently. The metal has that particular warmth that comes from handling." Rose, who had been standing motionless by the door like a statue of guilt, suddenly swayed as if she might faint. Mrs. Finch, ever attentive to such things, started forward with a cry of concern, but Rose steadied herself against the door frame, her knuckles white where they gripped the wood. "Perhaps Rose should sit down," Miss Marple suggested gently. "The afternoon has been rather trying for everyone." "I'm quite well, thank you, miss," Rose managed, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just a bit warm, perhaps." Miss Marple studied the girl with the kind attention she might show a wounded bird. The fresh apron was pristine white, but there was something about the way Rose held herself that suggested the change of clothing had been more than routine housekeeping. "That's a lovely fresh apron, my dear. So crisp and clean. You're very conscientious about your appearance." The compliment seemed to distress Rose rather than please her. She pressed her lips together as if afraid that words might escape without her permission, and her eyes darted toward her mistress with the desperate look of someone seeking guidance in treacherous waters. "Rose takes great pride in her work," Widow Harrington said, though there was something forced about her praise. "She's been with us since just after the Colonel's passing. Very reliable, very trustworthy." The emphasis on trustworthy hung in the air with particular weight, and Miss Marple noted how Lionel's eyebrows rose slightly at his aunt's vehemence. He had been watching the proceedings with the air of someone at a rather tedious play, but now his attention sharpened, and Miss Marple caught the calculating look that passed between nephew and aunt. "I'm sure she is," Miss Marple said warmly. "It's so difficult to find reliable help these days. Young people have so many opportunities now, so many choices. It speaks well of your household that Rose chooses to stay." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "Though I imagine the work can be challenging at times. So many delicate things to care for, so many ways for accidents to happen." Rose's face had gone from pale to ashen, and she swayed again, this time more noticeably. Mrs. Finch, who had been hovering with maternal concern, finally took action and guided the girl to a chair, clucking over her like a worried hen. "There now, dear, you just sit quietly for a moment. Perhaps a glass of water." "That would be very kind," Miss Marple said before Rose could protest. "And while Mrs. Finch is seeing to Rose's comfort, perhaps I might trouble you for that envelope I mentioned, Mrs. Harrington. I have a small theory I'd like to test." The widow hesitated, her hand moving unconsciously to the frayed ribbon at her throat, a nervous gesture that Miss Marple filed away with all the other small observations that were beginning to form a pattern in her mind. The afternoon light was fading now, casting longer shadows across the room, and in that golden dimness, the truth seemed to hover just beyond reach, like a butterfly that might settle if one remained perfectly still. "Of course," the widow said finally, moving toward the writing desk with reluctant steps. "Though I confess I don't understand what you hope to accomplish." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said gently, "the most important thing is not to accomplish anything at all, but simply to provide a safe place for truth to rest when it grows tired of hiding." She glanced toward Rose, who was sipping water with shaking hands, and then back to the widow, whose face had taken on the expression of someone who had been holding her breath for far too long. Truth has a way of finding its own path home, given the proper encouragement. The room fell silent, except for the soft tick of the mantel clock and the gentle rustle of Rose's skirts as she shifted in her chair. Miss Marple settled back to wait, her hands folded peacefully in her lap, her eyes bright with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most important revelations often came not from clever questions, but from simple kindness offered at precisely the right moment. The widow's hand trembled as she reached for the brass key, and Miss Marple observed how the simple action seemed to require enormous effort, as if each movement fought against invisible restraints. The ribbon caught momentarily on the widow's collar pin, creating a small delay that allowed Miss Marple to note the faint discoloration where anxious fingers had worried at the fabric repeatedly. When the key finally came free, it pulsed with unnatural warmth in the widow's palm, speaking eloquently of recent and frequent handling, despite the implications of long-sealed secrets. "I must warn you," Widow Harrington said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that some of these papers are of a very personal nature." Her fingers hovered over the lock as if touching it might release something she was not prepared to confront. The key turned with surprising ease, and the drawer slid open to reveal its carefully arranged contents. Letters tied with faded blue ribbon, a small amber bottle with its label removed, and a jeweler's loop that caught the afternoon light like a tiny crystal ball. Miss Marple lifted the loop with gentle curiosity, peering through it at the blue bowl with the innocent air of someone discovering a fascinating new toy. Through the magnification, the crystalline residue revealed itself in intricate detail. Not the coarse granules of kitchen sugar, but something far more geometric and deliberate, with tiny facets that caught light like miniature prisms. "How interesting," she murmured, setting the instrument aside to examine the small amber bottle. The acrid scent that emerged when she lifted the cork made her eyes water slightly. "Rather strong, isn't it? I imagine one would need to be quite careful with the application." From the drawer, she selected a cream envelope, noting how its surface bore the same iridescent sheen she had observed in the bowl's residue. The paper felt oddly stiff beneath her fingers, as if it had been dampened and dried repeatedly, and when she brought it closer to examine it, the sweet metallic tang was unmistakable. The Colonel was quite meticulous about his correspondence, I see. Even his envelopes have that particular finish that speaks of careful attention to detail. Rose's water glass slipped from her trembling fingers, crashing to the floor with a sound that seemed to shatter more than just porcelain. The girls stared at the spreading puddle and broken fragments as if they represented some terrible prophecy, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she whispered. "I'll clean it up directly." "Leave it," the widow said sharply, then softened her tone with visible effort. "You're clearly not yourself today." Miss Marple returned the envelope to the drawer, but left it slightly ajar, then moved to examine the sugar tongs once more. The stickiness near the hinge was minimal but unmistakable, and she observed how the cut glass sugar bowl showed a curious dusted appearance down one side, as if something had brushed against the lumps and left behind a kiss of powder. How very helpful these little tools are for picking up small, precious things one is afraid to touch with bare fingers, she observed mildly. One doesn't want to drop them after all. "Rose, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had, over the years, encouraged countless confessions from troubled souls. "When you changed your apron earlier, did you perhaps notice anything unusual? Any particular scent or marks that required special attention?" Rose's composure crumpled like tissue paper in rain. "I didn't mean—" She swallowed convulsively, her reddened wrists stark against her white cuffs. "It was catching on the antimacassar where you put it down, ma'am, and I thought only to smooth the cloth. The ring tipped into my hand, and the sapphire—" She stopped, looking at Miss Marple as if the older woman held out a lifeline over dangerous water. "It came away, just rolled like a bead onto the desk. And you caught it with the tongs because your fingers were shaking," Miss Marple supplied gently, thinking it would be safer that way. "Yes, miss, I saw it, little and blue, like the vicar's wife's brooch, only brighter, and I thought if I could just stick it back with some of Cook's gum for the labels." Rose's voice broke. "But it wouldn't stay. It kept sliding, and I cleaned it with the spirit from the cupboard like Mrs. Finch taught me for grease stains, but it made no difference, and then the Colonel's picture slipped when I leaned over, and it knocked the bowl, and—" Her hands spread helplessly. "It fell, miss. I heard it tinkle, and then I couldn't see where it had gone." Miss Marple nodded with perfect understanding, crossing to the fireplace where she knelt with care that belied her age. Behind the fire-iron stand, ash had drifted in a pale crescent, and she used the envelope's edge like a small spade, encouraging the powder into a neat heap. Something minute and bright winked up at her, a sliver of gold, curved like a fingernail clipping, the broken prong that had once held the sapphire secure. She rose and placed it gently in the widow's palm. "I think your instinct about sentimental value was quite correct. This little soldier has seen years of faithful service. But when prongs wear thin, stones begin to move, and once a prong breaks, there is very little to hold it, the widow finished, her voice hollow with understanding. She cradled the gold fragment as if it were infinitely precious, and Miss Marple saw in her face not the relief of mystery solved, but the deeper anguish of someone who had been protecting far more than a simple accident. "The sapphire may yet be found," Miss Marple said softly, settling back in her chair. "Stones are perverse creatures. They roll where no one would believe there is space. A little draft from the chimney, a slope in the floorboards, even a gap between boards and skirting." She paused, her keen gaze taking in the widow's continued distress, Rose's guilty relief, and Lionel's calculating attention to every word. "But I suspect, Mrs. Harrington, that the ring's disappearance is not the source of your greatest concern. Sometimes the accidents we fear to confess reveal truths we fear even more to acknowledge." The afternoon light had deepened to burnished gold, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet, and in that warm glow, Miss Marple waited with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most important revelations often required not clever questions, but simply the courage to speak truths that had been carried too long in silence. The widow's fingers closed around the broken gold fragment with a grip that spoke of something far beyond attachment to a piece of jewelry. Miss Marple observed how the simple gesture seemed to drain what little color remained in the woman's face, leaving her looking as fragile as the porcelain scattered across the carpet. The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with tensions that had nothing to do with missing stones and everything to do with secrets that cut far deeper than surface appearances. "You are quite right, Miss Marple," Widow Harrington said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been holding back a flood for far too long. "The ring is not my greatest concern." She moved to the writing desk with deliberate steps, her silk skirts whispering against the furniture, and withdrew from the still-open drawer a leather portfolio that Miss Marple had not noticed before. The leather was worn smooth in places, as if it had been handled repeatedly by anxious fingers seeking comfort in familiar textures. Rose's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Miss Marple had begun to suspect. The girl's earlier distress had not been merely about a broken prong or a lost stone, but about stumbling upon evidence of something far more significant. When the widow opened the portfolio, revealing a collection of documents and photographs arranged with military precision, Rose's face went from pale to ashen. "I discovered this 3 months ago," the widow continued, her words measured and deliberate, "when I was organizing the colonel's papers for the solicitor." She spread the contents across the desk's polished surface like a card sharp revealing a losing hand. Bills of sale, correspondence with dealers in London, receipts for items I had never seen. The colonel had been selling our possessions for years, replacing them with copies so skillfully made that I never suspected. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest, her keen eyes taking in the evidence that told a story of systematic deception. The documents were meticulously organized, each bearing the colonel's precise handwriting, and the dates revealed a pattern that stretched back nearly to the beginning of their marriage. She lifted one of the photographs, showing a man she recognized as the colonel, in conversation with someone whose face had been carefully obscured. "The Dresden shepherdesses," Miss Marple observed quietly, glancing toward the display cabinet where the porcelain figures stood in their eternal pastoral poses. "Reproductions, everyone," the widow confirmed, her voice hollow with betrayal. "As are the silver tea service, the Persian carpet, even my mother's jewelry, all sold and replaced with copies so skillfully made that I lived among them for years without knowing." She touched the broken gold fragment in her palm. "This ring was paste, Miss Marple. The real sapphire was sold 2 years ago to pay gambling debts I knew nothing about." Lionel had grown very quiet during this revelation, his earlier restlessness replaced by the stillness of someone performing rapid calculations. Miss Marple observed how his gaze moved between his aunt and the portfolio, and she caught the moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. Not shock, but recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle he had been working on were finally falling into place. "You knew," the widow said, her attention fixing on her nephew with laser precision. "That's why you've been so persistent about visiting, why you've been asking about the Colonel's papers and the state of his affairs." "I suspected," Lionel admitted, his careful composure slipping like a mask grown too heavy to maintain. There were whispers in London, rumors about Uncle Henry's activities, men asking questions in clubs, debts that seemed to follow his name, but I never imagined the extent of it. "The extent of his deception," the widow said, moving to the window where autumn shadows were lengthening across the garden. "Or the extent of what he still owes." She turned back to face them, and Miss Marple saw in her expression the terrible dignity of someone who had learned to carry unbearable knowledge with grace. "The creditors have been very patient, very discreet, but patience, I have learned, is not the same as forgiveness." Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of understanding that came when seemingly unrelated facts began to arrange themselves into coherent patterns. The widow's distress over a paste ring, Rose's guilty anxiety about breaking what was already broken, Lionel's calculating presence, the careful maintenance of appearances in a house where nothing was quite what it seemed, all of it suddenly made perfect. Terrible sense. "They've contacted you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had, over the years, drawn countless confessions from troubled souls. "The people to whom your husband owed money. They want payment. They believe you have access to valuable items that might satisfy the debt." The widow's silence was answer enough. She returned to her chair with movements that spoke of exhaustion held carefully in check, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. They were very polite at first, gentlemen callers who expressed condolences and mentioned small matters that required attention. But politeness, I have discovered, can be more frightening than threats when it carries such implications. Rose, who had been listening with the wide-eyed attention of someone discovering that her small world was part of a much larger and more dangerous one, suddenly spoke up. "Ma'am, is that why you've been so particular about the cleaning lately? Why everything must be kept just so?" "Because appearances matter more than ever when they're all one has left," the widow replied with a sad smile. "When the creditors come calling, they expect to see evidence of the prosperity they believe exists. They mustn't suspect that they're looking at clever copies and empty promises." Miss Marple rose and moved to the display cabinet, examining the Dresden shepherdesses with new understanding. Up close, the differences were subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The glaze slightly too perfect, the painting just a touch too precise, the weight not quite right in her experienced hands. "How many people know the truth?" she asked, setting the figure down with infinite care. "Until today, only myself," the widow replied. "I couldn't bear to tell anyone, couldn't bear to destroy the Colonel's reputation even after—" She stopped, her composure threatening to crack entirely. "But the situation has become impossible to manage alone. The creditors grow less patient, and I have nothing left to sell because there was never anything real to begin with." The afternoon light had faded to a deep amber, casting long shadows across the room and lending an air of melancholy to the assembled company. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most important revelations often required not clever questions, but simply the courage to speak truth that had been carried too long in silence. "And so you called for Lionel," she said gently, hoping that family might provide either assistance or at least understanding in this difficult time. "I called for Lionel," the widow confirmed, "because I am afraid, Miss Marple. Afraid of what these men might do when they discover that their patience has been misplaced, and afraid of what might happen to those in my household who depend upon me for their security." Her gaze moved to Rose, who sat clutching her water glass like a talisman against an uncertain future. The room fell silent, except for the soft tick of the mantel clock. each second marking the passage of time toward whatever resolution might emerge from this tangle of deception and desperation. Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully in her lap, her bright eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, already beginning to see the patterns that might lead toward a solution that preserved both dignity and safety for all concerned. The weight of the widow's confession settled over the room like dust after an explosion, each particle of truth finding its way into the smallest crevices of their understanding. Miss Marple observed how the revelation had altered the very air they breathed. Rose's shoulders had drawn inward as if preparing for a blow. Mrs. Finch's hands had stilled completely in her lap, and Lionel's calculating gaze had sharpened to the focus of a man reassessing every assumption he had made about his inheritance prospects. "The extent of the deception is remarkable," Miss Marple said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the Colonel's meticulous receipts. "Such systematic replacement requires not only considerable expense, but also a network of very skilled craftsmen and dealers. One doesn't simply walk into a shop and request a perfect copy of a Dresden shepherdess." The widow moved to the window again, her silk skirts rustling with nervous energy. Henry had connections in London, people who specialized in such arrangements. He spoke of them as discreet procurement specialists, as if giving them a respectable title made the transactions somehow more honorable. Her voice carried the bitter edge of someone who had learned to see through pretty words to ugly truths. And these specialists, Miss Marple continued, would naturally keep records of their transactions. They would know who purchased the original items, for how much, and when. Such information would be quite valuable to the right sort of person. Before anyone could respond, the sharp rap of the front door knocker echoed through the house with the precise authority of someone who expected to be received without delay. Rose started so violently that she knocked over the empty water pitcher on the side table, sending it rolling across the carpet with a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize the fragility of their situation. "That will be Mr. Carmichael," the widow said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said he would call this afternoon to discuss the Colonel's outstanding obligations." Miss Marple noted how the widow's use of the man's name suggested previous acquaintance, and not of the pleasant social variety. Rose had gone pale as winter moonlight and was pressing herself back into her chair as if she could somehow disappear into the upholstery. The girl's distress was so palpable that Miss Marple felt a surge of protective anger toward whoever had inspired such fear in an innocent young woman. "Perhaps I should withdraw," Mrs. Finch suggested nervously, gathering her crocheted reticule with trembling fingers. "This seems a matter for family." "Please stay," the widow said quickly. "I find I have need of witnesses to such conversations." Rose returned from answering the door with a man who entered the drawing room like a connoisseur examining a gallery. Mr. Carmichael was perhaps 50, with the kind of careful grooming that spoke of prosperity earned rather than inherited. His eyes moved around the room with practiced assessment, cataloging each item with the thoroughness of someone preparing an inventory. When his gaze settled on the Dresden shepherdesses, Miss Marple caught the slight narrowing that suggested professional interest rather than aesthetic appreciation. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, his voice carrying the measured courtesy of someone who had learned that politeness could be more effective than threats. "I trust you have had time to consider our previous discussion." "I have considered little else," the widow replied, her composure admirable given the circumstances. "Please, be seated." Carmichael chose a chair that provided him with a clear view of both the display cabinet and the writing desk, a positioning that Miss Marple found telling. He withdrew a leather portfolio from his coat and placed it on his knee with the deliberate care of someone handling valuable documents. "I've brought additional documentation that may clarify the situation," he said, opening the portfolio to reveal papers arranged with military precision. "Your late husband's obligations are more extensive than you may have realized. Beyond the immediate debts, There are matters of compound interest, storage fees for items held as collateral, and what we might call administrative costs associated with the investigation of certain discrepancies. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen eyes taking in the documents without appearing to do so. Investigation of discrepancies? How intriguing. What sort of discrepancies might those be? Carmichael's attention focused on her for the first time, and she saw in his expression the quick calculation of someone determining whether she represented opportunity or obstacle. Mrs. Marple, a friend of the family. I see. His smile was as carefully calibrated as his voice. The discrepancies involve items that were pledged as security but appear to have been replaced with reproductions of varying quality. Such substitutions raise questions about the intent behind the original transactions. The threat implicit in his words hung in the air like smoke from a poorly drawing chimney. Miss Marple observed how Rose's hands had begun to tremble again, and how Lionel's jaw had tightened with what might have been anger or calculation. Surely, the widow said carefully, if items were replaced without the knowledge of the creditors, that would be a matter for the courts to determine. Indeed it would, Carmichael agreed, his tone suggesting that court proceedings would be far more unpleasant for her than for him. However, such proceedings tend to be quite public, and the publicity surrounding cases of alleged fraud can be devastating to all involved. Servants, for instance, often find their reputations irreparably damaged by association with such scandals. Rose made a small, strangled sound, and Miss Marple felt her protective instincts sharpen to a fine point. The man's casual cruelty in threatening an innocent girl revealed more about his character than any amount of polite conversation could have done. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Carmichael?" Miss Marple asked, her voice carrying the deceptive mildness that those who knew her well had learned to recognize as dangerous. "Full cooperation in recovering the assets that rightfully belong to my clients. Complete access to the Colonel's papers, contacts, and any information that might lead to the recovery of the original items or their equivalent value." He paused, his gaze moving meaningfully to Rose. Such cooperation would naturally ensure that innocent parties remain protected from any unpleasant consequences. The room fell silent except for the soft tick of the mantel clock, each second marking the passage of time toward whatever resolution might emerge from this tangle of deception and threat. Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully in her lap, her bright eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, already beginning to see the patterns that might lead toward a solution that preserved both dignity and safety for all the innocent parties involved in this elaborate web of the Colonel's making. "I believe," she said finally, "that such important matters deserve careful consideration. Perhaps you would be so kind as to allow us until tomorrow to review your proposals thoroughly." Carmichael's smile suggested he had expected nothing less and nothing more. Carmichael's smile lingered with the calculated persistence of a man who understood that the most effective threats were those delivered with perfect politeness. He closed his portfolio with deliberate care, each movement designed to emphasize his complete confidence in the outcome of their negotiations. Miss Marple observed how his eyes continued their methodical inventory of the room even as he spoke of patience and consideration, cataloging details with the thoroughness of someone who expected to return under rather different circumstances. "Of course, Mrs. Harrington," he said, rising with fluid grace that somehow managed to convey both courtesy and menace. "Such matters should never be rushed. However, I feel compelled to mention that my client's patience, while considerable, is not infinite. They have been most understanding about the delays, but understanding has its practical limits." The widow's composure remained admirably intact, though Miss Marple noticed how her hands had begun to worry at the frayed ribbon at her throat, creating tiny pleats in the silk that spoke of anxiety, held carefully in check. "I appreciate their forbearance," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Tomorrow will allow me to consult with my solicitor and ensure that any arrangements we make are proper and binding." "Naturally," Carmichael moved toward the door, pausing to examine the writing desk with the casual interest of someone admiring a neighbor's garden while mentally calculating property values. "I shall call at 10 tomorrow morning. Perhaps by then, certain items might have been located that could serve as partial settlement while we work toward a more comprehensive resolution." Rose, who had been sitting frozen like a rabbit caught in torchlight, suddenly found her voice with desperate courage. "Sir, if I may, the ring that's gone missing. It was an accident, truly. I never meant any harm, and if it helps with the debts, I'll work without wages until—" "Rose, no," the widow interrupted sharply, but Carmichael had already turned his attention to the girl with the focused interest of a cat, spotting movement in tall grass. "A missing ring?" His voice carried casual curiosity that fooled no one in the room. "How unfortunate. Family pieces often carry stories that extend far beyond their monetary worth." Miss Marple felt the dangerous current that had entered the conversation, and she rose with deliberate care, positioning herself where she could observe both Carmichael's reaction and Rose's growing distress. "A small domestic mishap," she said lightly. "The sort of trinket that means everything to its owner and nothing to anyone else." "Indeed," Carmichael agreed, though his sharp gaze suggested he found the explanation less than satisfactory. "Loose stones have a way of turning up in the most unexpected places. Sometimes they find their way into hands that appreciate their true value more than their original owners ever did." His eyes moved meaningfully to Rose, who had gone white as bleached linen. After Carmichael's departure, the drawing room felt somehow smaller, as if his presence had consumed oxygen that was slow to replenish itself. The silence he left behind carried a different weight than before, the particular quality of air after lightning has struck nearby, charged with the promise of further disturbance. "I do not like that man," Mrs. Finch declared with unusual vehemence, then looked startled at her own boldness. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Harrington. It is not my place to—" "It is exactly your place," the widow interrupted, surprising them all. "This is our house, and we must all live under its roof together." Lionel, who had been watching the proceedings with the calculating attention of someone reassessing every assumption about his inheritance prospects, suddenly straightened with purposeful energy. "Aunt Althea, you cannot possibly give in to this blackmailer. The colonel may have been foolish, but he was still a Harrington. To let this mercenary walk in here and threaten us all." "And what precisely would you have me do?" the widow replied with weary patience. "He has documentation, Lionel. Detailed accounts of Henry's transactions. Denying them would only invite greater scrutiny, and a public scandal would ruin us all, especially those who cannot defend themselves against gossip." Miss Marple had moved to the fireplace during this exchange, drawn by the same instinct that had earlier led her to examine the blue bowl's crystalline residue. The fire had been banked and gone cold, but beneath the grey ash lay secrets that fire had tried but failed to consume completely. With the neat deliberation of someone unpicking a delicate seam, she used the corner of Carmichael's calling card to coax aside the fragile crust of ash. "Sometimes," she murmured, half to herself, "the most important evidence is what someone tried hardest to destroy." Something pale showed among the grit, no bigger than a child's fingernail. Miss Marple teased it free with infinite patience, revealing a torn stub of heavy paper, scorched black along one edge but miraculously preserved in its center. The printed ink had bubbled where heat had licked at it, but enough remained to make out a crown symbol and the letters B and S, in an ornate loop with a number beneath, and, in thick graphite pencil, a single word that had survived the flames. "Carter." "Pawn ticket," Lionel said immediately, leaning forward with sharp interest. "Baines and Son, Moorgate. Everyone in London knows them if they've ever fallen on the hard times." "You recognize the establishment?" Miss Marple inquired, studying the fragment with the attention she might give to a pressed flower from a beloved garden. "Respectable sharks," Lionel replied with rueful honesty. "They cater to gentlemen who find themselves temporarily embarrassed. Uncle Henry would have appreciated their discretion." The widow's face had gone very pale. "I knew nothing of any pawn tickets. Henry always maintained that pledging was beneath his dignity. Selling, yes, but never pawning." "Which suggests," Miss Marple said gently, "that either your husband's pride was more flexible than he admitted, or someone else used his name for convenience." She examined the charred date, making out what appeared to be a 2 beside the loop of a 0. 2 years ago, perhaps. Around the time you mentioned the sapphire was sold. Rose's sharp intake of breath confirmed the significance of the timing, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of understanding that came when seemingly unrelated facts began to arrange themselves into coherent pattern. The missing ring had been paste. The Colonel had been systematically selling genuine items and replacing them with copies, and now there was evidence of pawning under an assumed name. "Mrs. Harrington," she said quietly, "I believe we need to prepare for the possibility that Mr. Carmichael's visit tonight will not be limited to polite conversation." The widow's eyes widened. "You think he'll return?" "I think men who practice recovery prefer others to recover things for them initially. But when gentility fails to serve, they often rely on colleagues less particular about method." Miss Marple moved to examine the French windows, noting how the left latch sat improperly in its housing. "Rose, dear, are there other windows or doors that don't secure properly?" "The scullery bolt sticks in damp weather, miss," Rose confessed miserably. "And the morning room window, the latch needs lifting and pushing together, or it won't catch true." "Thank you. Knowing where drafts may enter is essential for staying warm." Miss Marple returned to the writing desk, her fingers moving over the papers with the delicate touch of someone handling butterfly wings. "Tonight, we must ensure that if someone does take the trouble to search, they find exactly what we wish them to find." She began removing the genuine documents from the portfolio, the bills of sale, the correspondence with dealers, the photographs that told the true story of the Colonel's deceptions. In their place, she arranged papers of similar bulk, tied with similar ribbon, but filled with carefully crafted misinformation. Under her direction, the widow transcribed portions in the Colonel's hand, altering dates subtly and inflating amounts in ways that could be easily disproved by anyone with access to the proper records. "What are you doing?" Lionel asked, watching with fascination as Miss Marple arranged the false documents with meticulous care. "Laying bread for birds," she replied with gentle satisfaction. "Guilty men enjoy the sensation of triumph. It clouds their judgment wonderfully." She placed the charred pawn ticket stub in the blue bowl, nestled among a few harmless letters tied with the frayed lavender ribbon, and returned the key to its place with the ribbon smoothed just so. "Lionel," she continued, "would you be so kind as to examine that troublesome window latch? If it requires special handling, please demonstrate the technique, then leave it almost, but not quite, properly secured." "Almost?" "Almost invites certainty. A man who sees his work half done believes Providence has become his valet." As evening shadows lengthened across the Persian carpet, Miss Marple surveyed their preparations with quiet satisfaction. The trap was set with the delicate precision of a spider's web, each strand positioned to catch exactly the prey they expected. Rose had been instructed to bank the fire less thoroughly than usual, leaving a small glow that would provide just enough light for someone to work by, while Mrs. Finch had been positioned in the morning room with a bright lamp and instructions to discuss domestic trivialities at length. The house settled around them with the familiar creaks and sighs of old timbers adjusting to new intentions. Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully in her lap, her bright eyes taking in every detail of their careful arrangements. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often undone not by elaborate schemes, but by their own assumptions about the predictability of their victims. "Now," she said with gentle authority, "we wait for Mr. Carmichael to discover just how unpredictable a group of frightened women can be when they decide to stop being frightened." Night descended upon the house with the particular weight that comes when every inhabitant listens for sounds that should not be there. Miss Marple had arranged their positions with the strategic precision of a general deploying troops, though her soldiers were an unlikely assembly of frightened women and one calculating nephew. The drawing-room lamps had been turned low on her specific instruction, leaving just enough illumination to make movement visible while creating pools of shadow that would conceal observers. Mrs. Finch had taken her assigned post in the morning room, her cheerful voice rising and falling in manufactured conversation with invisible companions about the proper way to darn stockings and whether Cook's seed cake recipe had changed since the old Queen's time. The gentle domesticity of her chatter would mask any small sounds that might emerge from other parts of the house, while her brightly lit window would draw attention away from the darker drawing room where their drama would unfold. Rose had been positioned in the kitchen with instructions to prepare a late supper that would require multiple trips through the corridors, her movements providing natural cover for any unexpected sounds. The girl's earlier terror had crystallized into a kind of fierce determination that Miss Marple found both touching and useful. Lionel had settled in the library with brandy and newspapers, playing the part of a nephew making himself comfortable in his aunt's hospitality while actually maintaining watch over the garden approach. The widow sat in the drawing-room's deepest chair, a book open in her lap, though her eyes remained fixed on the French windows where moonlight created geometric patterns through the glass. Her hands moved restlessly against the leather binding, and Miss Marple observed how the simple act of waiting had stripped away the careful composure that had sustained her through the day's revelations. Miss Marple herself had taken up her knitting, though the needles remained still in her capable hands. She had positioned herself where she could observe both the French windows and the writing desk, her chair angled to catch the faintest reflection of movement in the darkened glass. Before settling for their vigil, she had made one final adjustment to their preparations, using a length of Mrs. Finch's crochet cotton to create an almost invisible connection between the key's ribbon and a small crystal paperweight on the mantelpiece. The thread was gossamer fine and would break easily under careful handling, but any hasty movement would send the paperweight tumbling with a sound that would carry clearly through the quiet house. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passage of time with sonorous dignity, its chimes seeming unnaturally loud in the expectant silence. 11 o'clock came and went with only the wind in the eaves for company. Mrs. Finch's voice continued its gentle murmur from the morning room, occasionally punctuated by the soft rustle of fabric as she worked at her eternal mending. It was just past midnight when the first indication came that their vigil would bear fruit. A soft scraping sound, barely audible above the natural settling of old timbers, suggested someone was testing the French window latches with the patient thoroughness of experience. Miss Marple's fingers stilled completely on her knitting, though she made no other sign that she had heard anything unusual. The left window, which Lionel had so carefully left almost properly secured, yielded with a whisper of sound that spoke of skilled hands and practiced patience. A figure slipped through the opening with movements that seemed to flow like water, closing the window behind him with the care of someone who understood that carelessness left evidence. The intruder was compact rather than tall, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the room. He moved with the confidence of someone who had studied the space beforehand, avoiding furniture with an ease that suggested either remarkable night vision or prior reconnaissance. Miss Marple caught the faint scent that accompanied him, cheap hair pomade with a medicinal undertone, and the stale sweetness of tobacco that had been extinguished and relit too many times. He went directly to the writing desk without hesitation, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion that this was no random burglary, but a targeted search for specific items. His hands moved with professional efficiency, testing the key's ribbon with gentle pressure before drawing it free. The crochet cotton held for a moment, then parted with the softest whisper, allowing the paperweight to settle back into place without the betraying sound Miss Marple had prepared for hasty thieves. The drawer opened smoothly under his touch, revealing the carefully arranged portfolio with its collection of falsified documents. Miss Marple watched with quiet satisfaction as he lifted the bundle with the reverence of someone who believed he had found treasure. The papers disappeared into an inner pocket of his coat, flat against his ribs where they would be undetectable to casual observation. Something else caught his attention. The small blue bowl with its innocent collection of correspondence and the charred pawn ticket stub that had survived the Colonel's attempt at destruction. His fingers found the fragment by touch alone, and Miss Marple saw him lift it toward what little light filtered through the windows. Even in the dimness, she caught the sharp angle of his profile and the healing scratch along his jawline that Rose would later confirm she had seen before. The widow made no sound throughout the intrusion, her breathing so carefully controlled that she might have been carved from stone. Lionel remained motionless in the library, though Miss Marple sensed his readiness to spring into action should circumstances require it. Mrs. Finch continued her gentle monologue in the morning room, her voice a steady beacon of normalcy that masked the criminal activity unfolding mere yards away. When the intruder finally prepared to leave, he moved with the same fluid grace that had marked his entrance. The French window accepted him back into the night as silently as it had admitted him, leaving only the faintest disturbance in the heavy curtains to mark his passage. Miss Marple waited a full 5 minutes after his footsteps faded before allowing herself to relax, her keen eyes already cataloguing the evidence their visitor had left behind. "He has taken exactly what we wanted him to take," she said quietly, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. "And he has left us several interesting clues about his identity and employers." The widow emerged from her frozen stillness like someone waking from a particularly vivid dream. "I barely heard him move. How can someone be so silent?" "Practice," Miss Marple replied, rising to examine the writing desk with careful attention. "Men who make their living in other people's houses learn to move like cats." She touched the ribbon where the crochet cotton had parted, noting how cleanly it had separated under gentle pressure. He was professional enough to test for traps, but not quite careful enough to avoid leaving traces. She moved to the French windows and examined the latch mechanism, observing how it had been manipulated with tools that left tiny scratches in the brass. "Lionel, would you be so kind as to secure this properly now? Our visitor won't be returning tonight, but we shouldn't leave ourselves vulnerable to less skilled intruders." As Lionel attended to the window, Miss Marple returned to the writing desk and opened the drawer that had been so carefully searched. The false documents were gone, as expected, but their absence revealed something interesting, a faint dusting of ash on the drawer's bottom, so fine it was barely visible but unmistakably present. "He handled the pawn ticket with particular interest," she observed, touching her finger to the residue and examining it in the lamplight. "Ash from burned paper clings to everything it touches, and our visitor's gloves have carried traces of it to other surfaces." Rose appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Was it him, miss? The man who came about the gas meter?" "I believe so, my dear. The same narrow build, the same careful way of moving." Miss Marple smiled with gentle approval. "Your sharp eyes may prove very valuable when we speak with Mr. Carmichael tomorrow." The widow moved to stand beside the writing desk, looking down at the empty space where the portfolio had rested. "Do you really think this deception will work? That he'll believe those false documents represent the true extent of Henry's obligations?" "I think Mr. Carmichael will see exactly what he expects to see," Miss Marple replied, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone whose evening's work had been completed successfully. "Men who build. Their fortunes on other people's desperation often mistake fear for stupidity. Tomorrow, when he arrives expecting to find us broken by his threats, he'll instead discover that we've had time to prepare some surprises of our own." The house settled back into its natural rhythms around them, but Miss Marple remained alert, her bright eyes taking in every detail of the night sounds that spoke of a world where appearances could be deceiving and the most important truths were often hidden behind the most convincing lies. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often undone not by their failures, but by their successes, particularly when those successes were built on foundations that proved less solid than they appeared. "Now," she said with quiet authority, "we must prepare for Mr. Carmichael's return. By morning, he will have received his stolen intelligence, and he will arrive convinced that he holds all the advantages. It will be most educational to discover how quickly a man's confidence can transform into confusion when the ground shifts beneath his feet." The wind sighed through the ancient elms outside, carrying with it the promise of revelations yet to come, while inside the drawing room, Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully in her lap and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had set events in motion that would soon reveal truths that had been hidden far too long in shadow. Morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows nights of careful preparation, the autumn light streaming through the drawing-room windows with crystalline precision that seemed to illuminate every detail of their trap. Miss Marple had risen early to review their arrangements one final time, her experienced eye cataloguing each element they had so meticulously positioned. The writing desk sat innocently in its corner, the empty drawer now containing only genuinely mundane correspondence that would disappoint any subsequent searcher, while the blue bowl held nothing more suspicious than dried lavender and a shopping list in the widow's careful script. Rose moved through her morning duties with the focused determination of someone who had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The girl's earlier terror had crystallized overnight into something harder and more useful, her movements precise and alert as she attended to each task while maintaining constant awareness of her surroundings. The transformation from frightened servant to resolute ally had been remarkable to witness, and Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how the girl's spine had straightened with purpose. Mrs. Finch bustled about with unusual energy, her nervous excitement manifesting an excessive attention to domestic details. She had polished the silver tea service to mirror brightness and arranged fresh chrysanthemums with the particular care of someone who found comfort in familiar rituals, even when those rituals served as camouflage for more dramatic purposes. Her pink complexion glowed with anticipation, though she maintained her gentle chatter about household matters with admirable consistency. The widow sat by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a paisley shawl that had belonged to her mother, her hands steady now though shadows lingered beneath her eyes. The night's revelations had aged her, but they had also freed her from the terrible weight of carrying secrets alone. She examined the charred pawn ticket fragment with new understanding, seeing in its scorched edges not just evidence of her husband's deceptions, but proof that truth had a way of surviving even deliberate attempts at destruction. Lionel appeared at breakfast with a satisfied air of someone whose evening in the library had proved profitable beyond expectation. Among the Colonel's papers, he had discovered correspondence that revealed a network of transactions far more extensive than even his aunt had suspected. The letters documented not just individual sales and replacements, but what amounted to a systematic marketplace for discreetly embarrassed gentlemen, with the Colonel serving as both participant and facilitator. "The scope is remarkable," he said, spreading the correspondence across the breakfast table like a general reviewing battle plans. Uncle Henry wasn't merely selling his own possessions. He was arranging similar transactions for others, taking a percentage while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed in any of their households. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mr. Carmichael's motor car crunched on the gravel drive with the punctual authority of someone who believed he held all the advantages. Rose admitted him with perfect composure, though Miss Marple caught the girl's quick, confirming glance that identified their visitor as indeed the man who had posed as a gas-meter reader and later returned as their midnight intruder. Carmichael entered the drawing room with the satisfied bearing of someone whose evening had been most profitable. His eyes moved immediately to the writing desk, and Miss Marple observed the slight tightening around his mouth that suggested he was suppressing a smile of triumph. He carried no portfolio this morning. A telling detail that confirmed he believed himself already in possession of the information he required. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of a man who believed cunning had delivered him the upper hand. "I trust you have had time to consider the wisdom of cooperation in resolving your late husband's obligations." "Indeed I have," the widow replied, her composure admirable given the circumstances. "I've also had time to review certain documents that cast interesting light on the nature of those obligations." Miss Marple observed how Carmichael's confidence faltered almost imperceptibly at this unexpected response, though he recovered with practiced ease. "Any additional information would naturally be helpful in reaching a satisfactory resolution." "How fortunate," Miss Marple interjected gently, "because we have discovered several items that we believe will interest you greatly. For instance, this small fragment that survived an attempt at destruction." She lifted the charred pawn ticket stub from the blue bowl, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger. "A pawn ticket from Baines & Son in Moorgate, dated approximately 2 years ago." Carmichael's eyes fixed on the fragment with the intensity of a cat watching a mouse hole. "Interesting, though I fail to see how a damaged scrap of paper relates to the Colonel's documented obligations." "The interesting part," Miss Marple continued with her most grandmotherly smile, "is the name penciled at the bottom. Carter, not Henry Harrington, but Carter. A man who, according to these other documents Lionel discovered, was a frequent associate of the Colonel's during his more discreet transactions." The color began to drain from Carmichael's face as the implications settled like stones in still water. Miss Marple watched with scientific interest as his calculating gaze moved between the pawn ticket and the correspondence spread across the tea table, his mind clearly working to assess how much they actually knew versus how much they were deducing. "Furthermore," she added conversationally, "Rose has been most helpful in confirming that your associate, the gentleman who examined our gas meter so thoroughly last week, bears a distinctive healing scratch along his jaw. The same gentleman who visited us again last night, leaving behind traces of cheap pomade and stale tobacco, along with a faint dusting of ash on surfaces he handled." Rose stepped forward with quiet courage. "It was the same man, sir. Same height, same way of holding his head down like he didn't want the light to catch his face proper. And that scratch, thin and healing, just there." She gestured to her own jaw with steady fingers. Carmichael's carefully constructed facade began to crack like ice under spring sun. His portfolio, the one containing the false documents their midnight visitor had stolen, seemed suddenly to weigh heavily in his hands, its contents transformed from advantage to liability by the revelation that they had been deliberately planted. "What you acquired last night," Miss Marple said with gentle finality, "were documents we prepared specifically for your associate to find. They contain information that is both dramatic and entirely disprovable, designed to send you down paths that lead nowhere profitable while wasting considerable time and resources." The widow rose and moved to stand beside the writing desk, her hand resting lightly on its polished surface. "The real documents, Mr. Carmichael, tell a rather different story. They reveal that your clients may have been purchasing items under false pretenses, believing they were acquiring genuine articles from legitimate sources when they were actually participating in a sophisticated fraud network." Lionel stepped forward, his sharp features animated with the satisfaction of someone delivering a carefully prepared blow. The Colonel's correspondence shows that he was not merely a victim of circumstances, but an active participant in what amounted to a marketplace for forged provenance and false documentation. Your clients' reputations would suffer considerably if their involvement became public knowledge. The trap had closed with the precision of a well-made timepiece, each element clicking into place to create a mechanism that left their quarry with no avenue of escape. Carmichael stood frozen, his eyes darting between the evidence arrayed against him and the faces watching him with varying degrees of satisfaction and determination. The question now, Miss Marple said, her voice maintaining its deceptively mild tone, "is whether you prefer to continue this charade until it inevitably collapses under scrutiny, or whether you would rather reach an understanding that protects everyone's interests, including your own." The morning light streamed through the French windows, illuminating the scene with the clarity that comes when long-hidden truths finally emerge into daylight. Around the drawing room, the assembled company waited with the patient attention, people who understood that the most important negotiations were often conducted not through threats, but through the careful revelation of mutually assured vulnerabilities. Carmichael's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly as the full weight of his situation settled upon him. The predator had become prey, and the realization was clearly both unexpected and unwelcome. "What?" he asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Do you propose?" Miss Marple folded her hands peacefully in her lap, her bright eyes taking in every detail of their victory, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that the most dangerous opponents were often defeated not by force, but by their own assumptions about the predictability of their intended victims. The morning had brought more than light. It had brought the beginning of justice, carefully measured and precisely applied. The question hung in the morning air with the weight of defeat, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for Carmichael to fully comprehend how completely his position had deteriorated. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had learned that the most effective negotiations were conducted not through threats, but through the patient revelation of mutually beneficial truths. "What we propose, Mr. Carmichael, is quite simple in its essence, though rather complex in its execution," she began, her hands folded peacefully in her lap as if discussing the weather rather than dismantling a criminal enterprise. "We propose to restore honesty to the proceedings while protecting the innocent parties who have suffered through no fault of their own." The widow moved from the window with renewed purpose, her silk skirts rustling with each measured step. The morning light caught the determination in her eyes as she faced the man who had threatened her household with such casual cruelty. "The documents your associate acquired last night will indeed prove valuable to you, Mr. Carmichael, though not in the way you intended. They contain information so dramatically false and easily disprovable that your clients will waste considerable resources pursuing phantoms while we address the actual situation through proper channels." Lionel stepped forward, his sharp features animated with the satisfaction of someone delivering a carefully prepared counterstroke. From the writing desk, he withdrew a leather portfolio unmarked by the wear that characterized the Colonel's original papers. "The genuine documentation tells a far more interesting story than simple debt replacement. My uncle was not merely selling his own possessions. He was facilitating an entire network of discrete transactions, taking percentages while maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed in any household involved." Miss Marple observed how Carmichael's eyes moved restlessly between the speakers, his calculating mind clearly working to assess the full scope of what they had discovered. The network, you see, was remarkably sophisticated. Dealers who specialized in creating perfect reproductions, collectors who knowingly purchased items of questionable provenance, and facilitators who arranged the entire process while maintaining plausible deniability for all concerned. Rose stepped forward with the quiet courage that had emerged from her night of terror and resolution. "You're Mr. Pike, the man with the gas meter story. He's been watching this house for weeks, sir. I've seen him 3 times, always with that nervous way of checking his pocket watch and looking over his shoulder. He's got a crescent-shaped scar on his left hand and favors his right foot when he walks. Yesterday morning, he tried the study door handle when he thought no one was looking." The precision of her observations seemed to shake Carmichael more than any of their previous revelations. The girl he had dismissed as insignificant had been cataloguing evidence with the thoroughness of a trained investigator, and a testimony would be devastating in any formal proceeding. "The charred pawn ticket," Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, "bears the name Carter, Not Henry Harrington, but someone who used the Colonel's connections to conduct business under an assumed identity. This Carter, according to the correspondence Lionel discovered, was both client and collaborator, purchasing genuine articles at deflated prices while selling reproductions at considerable profit. Mrs. Finch, who had been listening with the bright attention of someone following a particularly engaging theatrical performance, suddenly spoke up with unexpected sharpness. "I remember now. A man came collecting for the War Widows Fund last month, pressed too hard at the doorstep, and left smudges on the brass plate. Tallish fellow with a hat too tight for his head, always smoothing his hair against the grain. Could that be your Carter?" The accumulation of observed details was clearly overwhelming Carmichael's remaining composure. He sank into the nearest chair with the boneless collapse of someone whose carefully constructed plans had dissolved into chaos, his portfolio sliding from nerveless fingers to rest against his knee. "What you're describing," he said finally, his voice hollow with defeat, "would destroy my business entirely. My clients trust me to handle their affairs with discretion, not to expose them to scandal and legal complications." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed with her most grandmotherly smile. "Which is why we offer an alternative that serves everyone's interests more effectively. Your clients recover their losses through the network that actually profited from the Colonel's deceptions. Mrs. Harrington retains her home and dignity. Rose and Mrs. Finch continue their employment without fear of retribution. And you preserve your reputation by demonstrating that you can protect your clients' interests without destroying innocent lives." The widow's voice gained strength as she outlined their specific terms. "We want the genuine articles that were taken from this house returned, or their full market value provided through legitimate channels. We want an end to these predatory demands disguised as legitimate claims, and we want assurances that the network of forgers and fraudulent dealers will be properly exposed and dismantled." Lionel added the crucial legal framework. "I shall telephone Mr. Symes immediately and have him bring his most serious clerk with proper documentation. We'll also contact Baines & Son in Moorgate. Pawnbrokers are great respecters of correct procedure when the light is properly shown upon their activities. The phrase, holding pending verification by counsel, tends to concentrate their attention wonderfully." Miss Marple rose and moved to examine the French windows, where the morning light revealed the faint scratches left by Pike's entry tools. "Your associate will need to be managed carefully, Mr. Carmichael. Men who imagine themselves indispensable often return to admire their work. They cannot help themselves. They have the vanity of tomcats. But a word from you about the evidence we've gathered should convince him that discretion has become his most valuable asset." The trap had closed with the precision of a well-made timepiece, each element clicking into place to create a mechanism that left their quarry with no avenue of escape, while offering a path toward redemption for those wise enough to recognize it. Carmichael sat in defeated silence, his eyes moving between the evidence arrayed against him and the faces watching him with varying degrees of satisfaction and determination. "The choice," Miss Marple said finally, "is between destruction and reconstruction, between pursuing a path that damages everyone involved, or choosing one that allows healing and justice to emerge from the wreckage of the Colonel's deceptions. We can expose the entire network publicly, destroying reputations and inviting criminal prosecution for all concerned. Or we can work together to ensure that justice is served quietly, efficiently, and with minimal damage to those who deserve protection." Carmichael's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation settled upon him. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its earlier confidence, reduced to the raw honesty of someone who had run out of alternatives. "I will need complete documentation of the network. Names, addresses, transaction records, and evidence that will satisfy my clients that their losses can be recovered through legitimate channels rather than through threats against innocent parties." "Naturally," the widow agreed, moving to the writing desk with renewed purpose. "We have prepared comprehensive files that will serve your needs admirably. You will find them quite illuminating regarding the true scope of the deceptions involved. Rose stepped forward one final time, her quiet dignity transformed into something far more formidable than the frightened girl who had broken a paste ring the previous afternoon. And you will ensure, sir, that your Mr. Pike understands that any further visits to this house or this village will result in immediate contact with the constabulary. We have detailed descriptions of his appearance, his methods, and his associates. The evidence would make for very interesting reading in the morning papers. The morning light streamed through the windows with crystalline clarity, illuminating not just the physical details of their drawing room, but the moral landscape they had so carefully mapped throughout their investigation. Around the assembled company, the sense of resolution was palpable. Not the hollow victory of revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of justice carefully measured and precisely applied. Miss Marple returned to her chair with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that even the most hardened hearts could sometimes be reached through patient application of truth and consequence. The needles of her knitting began to move at last, calm and determined, each stitch an answer to a knot, each row a plan made visible in wool and patience. "I believe," she said with gentle finality, "that we have reached a most satisfactory understanding. Sometimes, Mr. Carmichael, the most valuable assets are not those that glitter in display cases, but those that reside in the quiet corners of truth, discretion, and human dignity properly preserved." The predator had indeed become prey, but more importantly, he had been offered the opportunity to transform himself into something more honorable than either. The morning had brought more than light. It had brought the beginning of justice, carefully measured and precisely applied, with room for redemption for those wise enough to recognize it when offered with such deliberate grace. The question hung in the morning air with the weight of complete defeat, and Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for Carmichael to fully comprehend how thoroughly his carefully constructed world had crumbled. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who understood that the most lasting victories were achieved not through punishment alone, but through the patient restoration of order and dignity to those who had suffered through no fault of their own. "What we propose, Mr. Carmichael, is quite straightforward in principle, though it will require considerable effort in execution," she began, her hands folded peacefully in her lap as if discussing arrangements for a garden party, rather than the dismantling of a criminal enterprise. "We propose to restore honesty to these proceedings while ensuring that justice is served through proper channels, protecting the innocent while holding the guilty accountable for their actions." Before Carmichael could respond, the sharp rap of wheels on gravel announced the arrival of Mr. Symes, the family solicitor, who entered the drawing room with his solemn clerk and a black tin box that looked as though it had attended every serious legal conversation in the county for the past 30 years. He listened without interruption as the facts were laid out with methodical precision, his pen scratching with judicial calm while Carmichael sat motionless, his earlier confidence transformed into the stillness of someone calculating rapidly diminishing options. "You will furnish, in writing, an undertaking to suspend all claims against Mrs. Harrington pending resolution through verified recovery channels," Mr. Symes stated with the impartial authority of someone accustomed to reducing complex human dramas to manageable legal frameworks. "You will also notify your associate that any further unauthorized entry will be reported with sworn statements and physical evidence. I imagine you understand the advantage of speed in these matters." Carmichael nodded once, the movement seeming to cost him considerable effort. "You will have the letters by afternoon," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier smoothness. "And the name of Carter," Miss Marple added, her tone so mild it hardly seemed a request. "Real names are such helpful things when one is engaged in replacing falsehood with truth." He hesitated, then exhaled with the sound of someone releasing a burden too long carried. "Edmund Carter, dealer by trade, chameleon by inclination. He uses charitable collections as cover when he needs to appear respectable. Your maid's description is exact. The too-tight hat helps conceal a scar at his hairline from an old altercation with a dissatisfied client. When Mr. Symes telephoned Baines & Son in Moorgate, Miss Marple observed the careful precision with which he framed his inquiries. The charred pawn ticket number could not be fully deciphered, but the shop's crest and the approximate date narrowed the ledger entries to a specific afternoon in May, 2 years prior. There had indeed been a stone, described as blue of considerable size, deposited by E. Carter and transferred within the month to a private buyer through a dealer in Bayswater. You see, Miss Marple said gently when the solicitor concluded his call, truth does not vanish simply because someone holds it over flame. It may curl and blacken at the edges, but it remains quite legible to those who know where to look. Over the following weeks, the machinery that Miss Marple preferred, gentle, inexorable, and thoroughly respectable, began to turn with the precision of a well-maintained timepiece. Mr. Symes travelled to London with documentation that opened doors previously sealed by discretion and mutual benefit. Carmichael, now committed to a path that offered survival rather than profit, applied pressure where it would be most effective without creating the sort of public scandal that would destroy everyone involved. The transformation in the household was remarkable to witness. Rose moved through her duties with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that courage, once found, became a permanent addition to one's character. The girl's evolution from the trembling servant who had feared discovery of a broken paste ring to the steady young woman who had faced down professional criminals with clear-eyed determination represented one of those small miracles that Miss Marple had learned to recognize and treasure. Mrs. Finch resumed her domestic routines with renewed energy, her earlier nervous flutter replaced by the satisfaction of someone who had played a crucial role in restoring order to her world. She took particular pleasure in examining each recovered item with the thoroughness of someone who understood that authenticity lay not just in hallmarks and provenance, but in the weight and feel of objects that carried genuine history rather than clever imitation. The widow herself underwent the most remarkable transformation of all. The frightened woman who had lived among beautiful lies, terrified of losing everything, had discovered that truth, however painful its initial revelation, provided a firmer foundation than the most elaborate deceptions. She moved through her restored drawing room with renewed purpose, no longer starting at unexpected sounds or worrying at frayed ribbons with anxious fingers. It was during the third week of this gradual restoration that Miss Marple finally addressed the matter that had nagged at her since that first afternoon when the paste ring had clinked against porcelain with such deceptive innocence. She waited until the house had settled into its peaceful evening rhythm, then knelt once more upon the hearthrug with the patient curiosity of someone who had learned that small things often hid where large hands could not easily follow. The fire iron stand had hollow feet with narrow apertures barely visible beneath their ornamental scrolls. With a hairpin and the persistent determination that had made her chrysanthemums the envy of 3 counties, she coaxed at the accumulated debris until it yielded. Ash to one side, and with a soft tink of glass, the missing paste sapphire rolling into her palm with docile gleam. "Oh," Rose breathed from the doorway, her voice bright with triumph. "You found it, miss." Miss Marple handed the stone up with a gentle smile. Stones, like cats, go where they please and lie where they're most awkward to retrieve. Best to coax them rather than chase them. She turned to the widow with warm satisfaction. It will serve as a reminder until the proper one comes home. The widow accepted the paste sapphire as if it were the genuine article, not because she was deceived, but because symbols often mattered more than substance in moments when hope was being carefully rebuilt. "I shall keep it safe," she said, her voice steady and full for the first time since Miss Marple had known her. "And when the other is returned, I shall have them both reset, one for memory, one for the future." The genuine sapphire arrived by insured courier on a soft afternoon at the end of the month, carried in by Rose as if it contained the crown jewels themselves. Inside the velvet-lined box, nestled on white satin, lay a stone that did not merely glitter, but seemed to breathe within a fire, deep as well water in summer, alive in a way that paste could only attempt to imitate. The widow's hands trembled as she lifted it, and for a moment, Miss Marple glimpsed the young bride she must once have been, laughing in a garden with a man who had been charming and already a little untrustworthy. The network's dismantling proceeded with the thoroughness that legal pressure could achieve when applied by men who understood the value of discretion. Edmund Carter proved as elusive as his nature suggested, but the constabulary, invited into the matter through proper channels, discovered that men who favored too tight hats also left careless signatures in account books where they believed them least likely to be noticed. There were quiet visits to London establishments where porcelain smiled too brightly and silver gleamed with suspicious perfection. Pike vanished entirely from the vicinity, though reports suggested a man matching his description had been seen boarding trains to various distant destinations, always carrying considerable luggage and displaying the nervous energy of someone who had discovered that his particular skills were no longer in demand. As autumn deepened toward winter, Miss Marple prepared to take her final leave of the restored household. The drawing room glowed with lamplight and the quiet contentment of people who had learned that even the most carefully constructed lies could be unraveled by patient application of truth and the steady determination to protect what truly mattered. "I find myself wondering," the widow said, turning the genuine sapphire ring so that its facets caught the firelight. "What might have happened if you hadn't been here that afternoon, Miss Marple? If I had faced these threats alone, without your patient observation and gentle guidance?" Miss Marple considered the question with the thoughtfulness it deserved, her bright eyes taking in the transformed faces around her. "I suspect, my dear, that you would have found your own way to the truth eventually. Courage has a way of emerging when circumstances demand it, and you had already begun to ask the right questions. I merely helped you see that the answers were closer than you imagined." She rose to gather her knitting, the needles clicking with the satisfied rhythm of work completed. As she paused at the French windows to admire the garden where autumn flowers bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter, she reflected on how the most important victories were often those that restored faith in human nature, rather than simply punishing its failures. "Truth," she said quietly, more to herself than to her companions, "has a way of finding its proper place when given sufficient encouragement. Sometimes it simply requires patience, observation, and the courage to believe that honesty, however delayed, will eventually prove more powerful than the most elaborate deceptions." The widow walked her to the door, both rings now gleaming on her finger, the genuine sapphire catching the last rays of sunset, and beside it, the paste stone reset in simple gold as a reminder that even broken things could be made beautiful again when handled with care and understanding. As Miss Marple stepped into the gathering dusk, she carried with her the deep satisfaction that came from seeing justice served not through punishment alone, but through the restoration of dignity, security, and trust to those who had nearly lost them to another's elaborate web of deception. The evening air was crisp with the promise of winter, but the warmth that followed her down the garden path spoke of human resilience and the enduring power of truth to heal even the most carefully inflicted wounds. Behind her, the drawing-room windows glowed with honest light, and she smiled with the quiet knowledge that some victories were measured not in dramatic revelations, but in the simple restoration of peace to places where it had been too long absent. The paste ring that had started it all would serve its new purpose faithfully, a small monument to the truth that even the most innocent accidents could illuminate the darkest corners of human deception, and that patient observation, coupled with gentle courage, could transform fear into strength and lies into lasting peace.